Our responsibility to history is already clear: to answer these attacks and rid the world of evil.
Backward-ass, cave-dwelling fundamentalist.
It's no real news that 9/11 was a major turning point in American life and culture. Even now, 23 years later, images of American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175 crashing into the World Trade Center Twin Towers have become ingrained in the patriotic American imaginary as the most devastating tragedy in the contemporary history of the free world. These images themselves are haunting for a number of reasons. While obviously the attacks were traumatic for a lot of people, state-sanctioned violence that both preceded and followed the 9/11 attacks have really left a stain on the legacy of
the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world.
The days following 9/11 were particularly dystopian, an America unsure of its future, scared, reactive, angry, ultimately trying to grapple with the consequences of decades of American state-sanctioned violence. Spike Lee's 2002 film, The 25th Hour, is ultimately a film about violence, consequences, and New York City in the wake of 9/11. In the days following the attacks, drug dealer Monty is sentenced to 7 years in jail for selling drugs. During his last day of freedom, his friends and girlfriend discuss their grief over not having been able to stop this from happening. During this time, his friends also undergo their own consequences. Jacob, a high school teacher, kisses one of his students at a club, sending him into a spiral about the future of his career. Kostya, Monty's business partner, is found out for snitching on Monty, and the fate of his life is left in the hands of Russian mobsters as a consequence. The film, as you can probably grasp by this description, is not overtly about the 9/11 attacks. In fact, the film was in development when the attacks took place. Spike Lee, a New Yorker developing a film about New York City, swiftly decided that he wanted to incorporate the attacks instead of simply pretending like they never happened. The result is a film in which the aftermath of the attacks remain looming in the background of an already quite bleak film. In the last 23 years, so much media has been produced about 9/11. We've seen comedies in the likes of South Park. We've seen just countless kind of gross Islamophobic films about war and the aftermath of 9/11. We've seen romantic films where the big twist ending is the planes hitting the Twin Towers. But with all this media available, no film, at least that I've seen, has been quite as impactful at portraying just the bleakness of post-9/11 America, quite like The 25th Hour. Spike Lee undoubtedly has a really special relationship with New York City, having grown up in Brooklyn as a black man, seeing the city undergo countless transformations, rapid gentrification, and racial tensions. In response to these experiences, Lee has made a number of films about blackness in the city, one of the most famous examples being Do the Right Thing, a film following racial tensions in a Brooklyn neighborhood. Spike Lee has had a really impactful career discussing so many pressing issues about race in the city. He is also no stranger to controversy.
Following growing criticism, Spike Lee has scrubbed footage featuring 9/11 conspiracy theories from the final chapter of his 4-part HBO docuseries, NYC Epicenters 9/11 through 2021 and a half.
But controversy aside, from watching this documentary, it became really clear to me that 9/11 just had a huge impact on Spike Lee. And while the docuseries might be a much more comprehensive look at the events of 9/11 and the events that followed, I still find The 25th Hour in many ways to be a lot more powerful. While the film might not always be talking about 9/11, there's a real sense that everything is connected. While being driven to jail with his father after a day of intense grief, regret, and anxiety, Monty's father tells him the story of what his life would look like if, instead of driving to jail, they instead just kept driving west into the desert, where Monty could secretly start a new life, get a new job, start a family, grow old, and then tell them the story of his redemption, in which he tells his children, "It all came so close to never happening. This life came so close to never happening." The scene cuts to Monty and his father as they seemingly continue to drive towards the prison. This ending has been read as a revisiting of the classic white American dream, moving west and escaping into wilderness, an idea that is purely fantasy. Or, as Shaviro puts it, a denial of the harsh actualities of American urban life. The element of fantasy escapism, a beam of light at the end of a dark narrative, is something that I find particularly haunting about the film, in relation to both Monty's story and the story of 9/11. It really opens up the film's rigid timeline of approximately a day to incorporate questions of potential and uncertain futures of America post 9/11. I believe that 9/11 was a horrible tragedy and an attack on the US point blank. It was a really traumatizing event for thousands of people who lost family members, who have family members that are still missing to this day. In the same breath, I don't think that the US was in the right for a lot of actions leading up to and following the 9/11 attacks. Prior to 9/11, the US was very much backing a lot of violence towards the Middle East, which I find despicable. I think the way that the US handled the 9/11 attacks, reacting with violence, still reacting with violence to this day, is just really shocking and horrible. The politics surrounding the greater image of the 9/11 attacks are much more complicated than it just being a tragedy. When those two hijacked planes hit the Twin Towers, they weren't just hitting any building in the New York skyline. They were hitting the symbol of American capitalism and globalization, in which, like the name suggests, lots of global trading went down.
In this building, it's either kill or be killed. You make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners.
By 2001, at the end of the Cold War, America had become the ultimate image of the free world. A place in which capitalism allowed dreams to come true, a force that really just couldn't be touched. And through attacking the World Trade Center, the country, for the first time in contemporary history, was made to appear vulnerable. It makes sense that the 25th hour is set in the days after the 9/11 attacks. The story is really dreary, existential, angry, and anxious. People at crossroads, facing life-changing news, coping with loss and fear. It also contains elements of skepticism. In one scene, Monty's friends, Jacob and Frank, look at the rubble of 9/11, which Frank's apartment overlooks. Jacob states that the air quality in the area is really bad, but Frank brushes the comment off, stating that the EPA has assured that the air quality is fine, a scene which both helps to define the character's reactions to trauma, but also to depict Lee's own skepticism towards the EPA's controversial ruling, a topic that he returns to in his docuseries. And this reaction of skepticism makes a lot of sense to me. The US government has just made a lot of mistakes, and we don't really need an 8-hour docuseries to tell us this. There are constantly scandals coming out. There are constantly these backward-ass laws being passed and overturned. It's just a huge mess. But huge crises, ones which shut down major cities like 9/11 or COVID-19, are ones that are particularly important because the entire world is just looking at the US government, looking at what they're going to do next. But while all eyes may be on the state in times of disaster, sometimes the focus of these eyes may be kind of narrow. I've talked about Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine in my video essay about Civil War, which if you want to check out, please do. In an interview about the book, the interviewer asked Klein to talk a bit about how some businesses were able to profit immensely from the 9/11 attacks. She responds, "One of the things that really struck me is how the stock market responds to hurricanes and terrorist attacks. The most significant change in recent years is that the stock market now responds favorably to terrorist attacks or narrowly averted attacks. A whole class of stocks jump. Disaster stocks, like surveillance companies. Homeland Security is now a $200 billion industry. There is a level of integration between Homeland Security companies and media companies. A company like that gains from the atmosphere of crisis and fear that is spread through media outlets. It's a war against evil everywhere with no end. That's a war that can't be won, and you couldn't ask for a more profitable business plan. The only thing that threatens it is peace. This is really a product of the American dream. You can make it big, but oftentimes it's at the expense of others. Oftentimes you're taking advantage of situations in which others are facing a lot of misfortune. And the flaws in the system of capitalism are never more overt than in a post-disaster context. And this is one of the reasons why I find 9/11 conspiracy theories to be so interesting, the ways in which they don't want to talk about these bigger systemic issues. They just want to avoid that topic. Like, do I believe 9/11 was an inside job? No, I don't. Do I believe that the state and capitalist systems immediately took advantage of the 9/11 attacks in order to strengthen national image and gain capital? Yes, I do. And I think that questioning government intentions and actions after times of crisis, or just in general, is a very valid thing to do. It's a very valid form of skepticism. But at the end of the day, we can say that America took advantage of its citizens in a time of extreme vulnerability without saying that it was an inside job. At the end of the day, they still implemented these really sketchy policies. They still waged wars. They still took advantage of people. In discussing the topic of 9/11 trutherism, Chomsky has stated that this movement has really effectively, quote, drawn enormous amounts of energy and effort away from activism directed to real and ongoing crimes of state and their institutional background. Much like the government used the 9/11 tragedy as a means for profit and to implement these new shady policies, conspiracy theorists are just similarly using these huge events to draw attention away from real systemic issues. The 25th Hour is such a powerful film because of its focus on citizens of New York City and their relationship to these complex systems of power in the American dream. While a lot of 9/11 media is so focused on the actual events that transpired on September 11th, as well as the events that followed, the 25th Hour's narrow focus on American systems that predate the events of 9/11, set immediately after the events of 9/11, and without much focus on the attacks themselves, allows for an interesting contextualization about the ways American systems understand justice, redemption, and consequences. It doesn't understand 9/11 as being a standalone event, but an event that exists in the midst of, and potentially as a consequence of, America's pre-existing systemic structures. While, like I stated before, the end of the film has been read as a critique of the white capitalist American dream of escape to the West, it's also able to imagine a world of justice and redemption outside of the confines of the prison industrial complex, in which Monty fears facing death, horrible living conditions, and SA as a consequence of dealing drugs. And while I understand how people might read the scene as being Monty fantasizing about taking the easy way out, not taking on his consequences head on, what would putting Monty in jail do at the end of the day, aside from perpetuate a cycle of violence? In a lot of ways, I think it's quite naive to just view the 9/11 attacks as a standalone event, just a random act of violence against America. In fact, Osama bin Laden has openly stated that the attacks were a reaction to America's backing of so much violence against the Middle East. And while I don't think that the violent actions taken by either side have proven to be in any way that effective, the situation is just simply not as simple as George Bush may have made it out to be when he stated,
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world.
Perhaps one of the most famous scenes in the 25th Hour sees Monty going on a seemingly stream-of-conscious hate-fueled rant about New York City, about immigrants, about Arab people and 9/11, about the state of the city itself. But in the end, there's a moment of self-awareness as he turns this hatred inwards. He states, "Fuck this whole city and everyone in it. Let earthquakes crumble it. Let the fires rage. Let it burn to fucking ash, and then let the waters rise and submerge this whole rat-infested place."
No, fuck you, Montgomery Brogan. You had it all and you threw it away, you dumb fuck!
The state's immediate reaction to 9/11 was violence, as we've talked about before in this video. Between 2001 and 2003, the Bush administration pushed for war in Iraq, a movement that was really genuinely stupid because there wasn't even a link between al-Qaeda and Iraq. But at this point, the fight had become greater. It had become the war on terror. While in 2003, 64% of Americans backed the war in Iraq, this number definitely dwindled in the rear view, with Americans no longer experiencing the heightened anxiety and rage of September 2001. Yet, we still see traces of Islamophobia still looming today, with reactions to October 7th seeming less like a novel reaction and more like the unleashing of previously held beliefs. Islamophobia has, in many ways, become rooted in patriotic American ideals. Beyond being a narrative about consequences, the 25th Hour is really a story about taking responsibility and creating your own redemption. While the film looks at the individual and systemic structures of America and turns them inwards for the viewers to ponder and question, America's reaction to 9/11 was one that never looked inward. That only caused it to strengthen its broken and unequal systems in the name of maintaining an image of power and prosperity. As I interpret it, the fantasy scene exists as an America that broke the cycle of violence, that was able to respond without ego, a world which will probably always exist in my mind as a fantasy. Now, when I talk about America taking responsibility for consequences of its actions, that's not me being like, no, America deserved 9/11. I'm very literally saying that 9/11 was a consequence of so much of this state-sanctioned violence against the Middle East. And while these consequences can't change after they occur, the way you deal with them, the way you react to them can change everything. Much like Monty's vision of escape is seemingly too perfect, too fantastic for the viewer of the 25th Hour to fully accept, it's hard to imagine massive changes to American systems, alternative justice, and responses to violence, without it beginning to feel like an idyllic fantasy. It makes sense to me as to why, after 23 years, 9/11 remains the image of violence in the West. Not for the citizens who suffered, but for the image of American strength that suffered. The grip that 9/11 has on America is so based in maintaining power, on maintaining the fantasy of pure freedom and prosperity, of the American dream. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you wanted to subscribe, like, comment, that would be great. I am slowly growing my channel. Thank you so much again for watching. Love you.